Let's talk about spears and why use a big one when you can use a small one. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So you will have seen hopefully that recently I put up a video talking about spear evolution in the age of armour and how spears essentially changed, or at least there was a tendency, a preference for certain types of spears in the age of plate armour. And that's for a number of reasons. It's to do with durability, it's to do with the kind of things you're stabbing, so penetration, also durability of the head. Additionally, also the size of the shaft, the thickness of the shaft, the length of the shaft. Those things relate, of course, to usage, whether you're using it one-handed with a shield or potentially even throwing it, or whether you're using it in two hands against other types of weapons that might be quite choppy, things like pollaxes and halberds and glaives and things like that. And so durability of the shaft as well, and also stiffness of the shaft. So if you're stabbing into mail, for example, you're stabbing into armoured foes, then you're going to need a certain stiffness of the shaft, because if the shaft flexes too much upon impact, then you're going to lose penetrative ability. Potentially even the shaft will bend and possibly even snap in the worst case scenario. Obviously that relates to the use of spears on horseback, aka lances, because lances have to have a certain degree of rigidity to them in order to, when you're moving at say 30 miles an hour on a horse, when you impact a solid target, for them to penetrate, number one, and also not break if you don't want them to break, number two. Obviously there are certain types of lances which are intended to break, but they tend to ironically be quite fat shaft lances, and they tend to be impacting with armour, so it's kind of a different consideration, but it's all related anyway. Now, taking all of these things into consideration, I looked at these two spearheads and I thought, Now, what are these two spearheads? Well, first of all, this is a relatively narrow spearhead. It's of a type that you can find really throughout history, since the Iron Age anyway. And this could be attached to a throwing spear, or it could be attached to a lance used on horseback, or it could be attached to a pike. So this type of spearhead could be found on the end of a Greek hoplite spear, or it could be found on the end of a 16-foot long Renaissance pike. It could be on a horseman's lance from all sorts of periods and places in the world. So it's a fairly generic type of spearhead actually, and they're often found on Dark Age or early medieval spears as well. But if we look at early medieval spears, they come in a big variety of shapes and sizes. And we don't really know necessarily what all of those types of spears were used for, or why there were so many different shapes of spearhead. Why were there so many different types of spearhead in the Viking Age, for example, so late Anglo-Saxon or late Frankish periods? Talking about 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. Why? We don't really know. There's a lot of assumptions made, and if you read books on the subject, you'll find the general assumption that smaller heads are used for throwing and larger heads are used for close-in combat. Perhaps even sometimes there's an assumption that larger heads are being used as two-handed spears and the smaller heads are being used as one-handed spears with shields. But the headline is, we don't really know. We can try and ascertain some clues from artwork, but if we look at ethnographic and other historical comparisons, we can't always make those assumptions. Just saying that a smaller head means it's for a throwing spear isn't necessarily correct. For example, sometimes a smaller head is found on a lance. If I just reach over here, I actually have a lance head, 19th century lance head here. Now this type is actually used for boar hunting, which is again confusing, because if we look at boar hunting spears for use on foot, they're often massive. So this is fairly small, but of course it's for a lance. Now, lances used in lots of periods of history are really quite long, and of course they're used, at least by most people, one-handed. So therefore, you don't want a particularly large spearhead, because you want the lance to be wieldy. You want the lance head to be not too heavy, not too large. It doesn't need to be. It's more about penetration and the speed of the horse. So, additionally, it might be for armour penetration. So a head like this will puncture through mail armour probably more easily than this will, or rather it will puncture more deeply. I'll get onto that in a second. So for penetrating deeply into a target, a more svelte, a narrower head will penetrate more deeply and more easily. Okay, it should be fairly obvious, I think. But perhaps it's for piercing shields. Perhaps it's for piercing enemy horses. Now remember, with a horse, You might not want a head that does a shallow injury, you might want a head that does a deep injury, but equally killing an animal as opposed to a human is somewhat different, because they tend to have, certainly things like horses and cows and even wild boars can have larger and in many cases tougher bodies than a human has. So often when we look at a hunting spear, it will be a different shape to a war spear, because the war spear might have prioritized nimbleness, or how far you could throw it, or having on a longer shaft like a pike or a lance, or indeed armor penetration. Whereas obviously for hunting, it's really all about killing the animal as effectively as possible. So very often that'll be about blood loss, or there might be barbs on the spearhead, like with some hunting arrows, for example, so that when your head goes in, if you've thrown it, it doesn't come out of the animal runs with the spear in it, and it makes the spearhead stays in and makes the wound even worse. So there can be all sorts of potential complications and things to take into consideration when you're designing a spearhead. So fundamentally, what are the advantages of this head? What are the advantages of this big head? And why possibly might they have been using these in the age of plate armour? On the surface of it, I kind of think if we didn't have any data to go from, if there weren't any manuscript pictures, if there weren't any surviving examples, you might think that the spearheads used or popular in the age of plate and mail armour might look somewhat like rondel daggers, because rondel daggers tend to have narrow, thrust-only blades, or at least thrust-centric blades, which are designed to puncture through mail or gambeson and make a deep hole and get in gaps. Okay, so you might think therefore that all spearheads would look like that. Unfortunately, they don't. They look like this. Why? Okay, let's come back to this again. Why don't we have more of these narrow hit spearheads? Well, the fact is we do have certain types of spear, loosely described there. For example, if we look at the tips on many halberds, they are in fact square and long. They seem to be for piercing through mail or other types of armour that you're able to pierce through. If you look at the tips on pollaxes, they are very often square shank, not dissimilar from rondel daggers quite often, although sometimes they have a head more shaped like this, although that tends to not be the norm. That tends to be the more rarer, I would say, to have a spear-shaped tip on a poleaxe. If we look at the tips of something like an ahlspiess, my German pronunciation is very bad of that, which is the ahl, I think, is an awl in English, which just means spike, so it's a long spike. Again, we've got a long spike. If we look at pike heads of the 17th century, they tend to be relatively small spikes, not dissimilar to this, a little bit shorter than this usually, actually. So these do seem to follow the pattern of being piercing centric weapons. So why were these big broad spearheads used? Well, I don't know the answer. I'm very interested to hear your theories on this. In an age when so many weapons seem to have very narrow piercing points designed to get between plates of plate armour or into things like mail-covered armpits or backs of knees or insides of elbows, places where there's no plate, but there is, or at least usually no plate, but there is mail or sometimes just padding designed to get in there and pierce deeply, you do get spikes. You do get essentially spearheads that are just like spikes. So why does the typical 14th and 15th century spearhead look like this, very broad? Well, I've got one possible idea. Okay, I'm going to put durability aside, because I think that if durability was the main concern, we wouldn't see those other long, thin, spike-like tips on halberds, poleaxes, ahlspiess, and so on. Why were these shaped like this? Well, I think one possible answer is, if we look at the weapons like halberds and poleaxes and ahlspiess, they all have things to stop over penetration. The ahlspiess has a rondel or disc guard at the bottom of the spike. The poleaxe has an axe and a hammer, or an axe and a spike, or a spike and a hammer. The halberd is similar to the poleaxe. It has lateral projections, an axe and a hook or a spike. So all of those things can't over-penetrate. However, a spear, whether it's used on horseback as a lance or whether it's used on foot as just a two-handed spear, can over penetrate. So possibly these are designed to penetrate no further than that, because it takes so much energy away as this enters the target that it is likely to only penetrate to a certain depth before it gets stuck. Why wouldn't you just have lugs on it? Well, we have other types of spears which have lugs on. We've got boar spears, which were used occasionally in warfare at the time. We've got types of corset and spetum and things like this that have projecting blades, early forms of partisan. We do have weapons that do have projections at the side, but there clearly are reasons why, and I'm not fully clear on those reasons, but there are clearly reasons why they didn't put projections on all spears. Why didn't all spears have projecting lugs or bars at the side or extra blades? We don't know exactly, but clearly they didn't have all. A typical spear or lance used either by a mounted knight or a knight on foot or man-at-arms on foot did not have lateral projections. So there must have been something about the lateral projections getting caught up, or making them somehow perhaps easier to command or grab or parry. I don't know. These are all just theories that I'm just spitballing here. But there must have been some mechanical reason why they didn't want to put lugs on all military spears. And so my theory at the moment is that this broadened blade and very sort of diamond shape almost, which we see in tons of 14th and 15th century art, is a way of preventing over penetration without adding lugs on. And I do think it's worth noting that when we look at partisans, for example, which start to come around in the 15th century, early forms of them, and really come into their own really in the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly the 16th. Partisans have a similar kind of blade shape to this, but they had added small lugs at the base. So the lugs are small, but they still have a broadening triangular blade. Now in that case, it means you can cut with them as well. And if we look at treaties like Marozzo or Manciolino, we see that they cut with them. But perhaps originally that stems from this type of spear where the original purpose is to prevent over penetration, because really after the first 4 or 5 inches, it kind of becomes useless penetration in the target. And this is even described with later on commando dagger type ethos and the design of things like the Fairbairn Sykes dagger and things like this. Over a certain length, you're just penetrating air basically, because you've already hit the internal organs you're aiming for, or the tendons and muscle or bone or whatever. So there's my theory. What is yours? Why is it that in the age of armour, despite the fact that we see spearheads like this very commonly throughout history, and particularly in the Dark Ages, when really the only armour that they're going to be encountering for the most part is a mail shirt and very often nothing at all, why were these more narrow heads that almost look more suited to armour penetration, why were they more popular? Or at least they were popular in that age and used extensively. And yet by the time we get to the age of plate armour with mail in the gaps, this type of really quite broad fat head, and yeah, okay, it's got a very thick cross section that in many ways is like certain armour piercing tips that we find on arrows and javelins and even poleaxes and daggers and stuff. But in terms of the shape, this broad triangular shape or diamond section shape, what are your theories of why it was like that? It couldn't have only been durability, because they didn't worry about that with pollaxe points or halberd points. Why were spearheads so fat in this period? My only, or rather, I won't say my only theory at this point, but I think the most plausible theory is it's to do with stopping power and keeping the opponent far away and preventing them from sliding up the shaft. And remember also, this is to do with not necessarily into their body, but it could be into the mail. So if you go into someone's armpit, maybe it will pierce through, and it won't, rather than going into their body, it will actually go through, might go through the muscle and get stuck in the mail. If this is stuck in gambeson or mail, you can still push them away and keep them at distance. With a narrow head, once you've made a gap that big in the mail, they can now pass all the way through and potentially come closer to you. So I think that it's something to do with stopping power and over penetration. What are your thoughts? I'm very interested to hear Monday video, so thought for Monday. Maybe this will become a thing, or maybe it won't. I don't know. Again, thoughts below. I'm very interested to see what your theories are below here. Thanks for watching. We'll be talking more about spears in the future. Obviously today we've just been looking at the head, but I hope to get back to my shaft really soon as well, because spear shafts just by themselves are super interesting things as well. Far more complex than you might think. It's not just a stick. Thanks a lot for watching. Check out the links below as well, and I'll see you soon back on the channel for another video. Cheers folks.